All right, welcome back. This is your second podcast of the year, your third section of Rome. We talked about how Rome was built up and then became an empire, and we talked about Christianity, and now we're going to talk about the fall of Rome. And when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're really talking about the fall of the western portion of Rome. The essential question that we're going to emphasize for this portion is what internal and external factors lead to the downfall of empires. So let's jump right in. First of all, Rome was a great empire, a big, vast empire that encompassed a lot of Europe, North Africa. But eventually, they became really big, almost too big to govern themselves. And we'll talk about what they did about that later. But one of the things that started happening was they had to feed a bunch of people, and they were not being very good with their farming practices. Too much of their farming practices depended on slave labor, so they weren't innovating any new practices, weren't trying anything new. There's also, because of constant warfare and protection of the empire, a lot of the battles took place and spilled over into farms and it ruined the farmland. So that was one of the first internal factors of the downfall of Rome is their farming practices and lack of food. Other things that happened was people weren't gaining new knowledge. People weren't learning new things. Again, with a large empire, it was hard to educate people. It was really only the rich people were being educated and poor people weren't. So the lack of knowledge really helped as another internal factor in the downfall of Rome. Also, communication with a large empire was hard to communicate. I mean, if you had to go from Rome, the base, the capital, all the way to Egypt or all the way to London in order to take a message, that just took a long time. By the time it got there, things might have been different. Also, people had to vote in Rome. So if you were in another province and you had to travel that far actually to vote, that could be a problem as well. We also start seeing a lack of the military is not being very loyal, and not necessarily because they were bad people, but with the lack of food and knowledge, and now there's been a trouble finding new wealth. They're not having any other places to conquer. They can't pay their soldiers, so the soldiers are just kind of getting fed up with working and not having food or good conditions or getting paid what they're supposed to get paid. And finally, corruption, and corruption is a vocabulary word. Politicians and leaders were doing the bidding of people that had money. So they'd be getting paid by people to make decisions instead of making the right decisions. So yes, it was still an empire, but there were still governors in each in different provinces and things like that. The Senate was around, even though it didn't really make big decisions. But those politicians and those leaders, instead of making the right decisions for the people or for the military, were making decisions for themselves and for money. So corruption, your vocabulary word is taking, in this case, is taking a bribe or taking money or taking gifts and making decisions for themselves instead of for the people. Now, as I said, Rome grew. In this map, you can see how large Rome was. Because of that, we have a leader, Diocletian, at one point says, hey, this place is so big, let's make it easier to govern. So he split it into two halves, east and west. I remember Diocletian, Diocletian, DI, like division. He divided Rome into two separate halves. And again, when we talk about the fall of Rome, this is the side that fell, the western side. Later, we have another leader, Constantine. We heard a little bit about him with Christianity. He actually made Christianity the official religion of Rome when he was the emperor. He moved, actually, at one point, Rome, the city of Rome, that was the capital. He moved that capital to what was Byzantium, and then changed the name to Constantinople. Along with all those other internal factors that I talked about in the fall of Rome, we also have external factors. And the main external factors are people invading Rome. We have the Franks, we have the Visigoths, we have the Vandals, We have all sorts of people that are the Huns coming in that are coming in to take over Rome. If you look at most of these routes, they're all coming into the western half. We have a couple people coming over here into the Eastern Roman Empire. Constantine is relatively safe, or sorry, Constantinople is relatively safe from these attacks. Most people are invading Rome, the city, and into the western half of Rome. Eventually, the city of Rome fell and the western half fell, and it's marked by the date 476 or the year 476 when Odoacer took over the city of Rome and became the first barbarian king of Rome. Later on in the next unit, we're going to learn about Clovis. He was a Frankish king, and he ended up uniting the whole area. And we're going to talk more about him and the Holy Roman Empire later in the next unit. So after the western portion of Rome fell, there are some things that Rome left behind. First of all, their writing system and their language. We're going to learn that our language and other languages are heavily influenced by their language. And philosophy. Philosophy is the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. So it's really just a deeper way to look at our surroundings and to look at why things are happening around us. And the main philosophy, or one of the main philosophies studied in Rome, was actually a Greek philosophy by a man named Zeno, and it was Stoicism. And this Stoicism talked about the school of thought that virtue, the highest good, is based on knowledge. So they were talking about virtue and doing the right things for your community and for your society. Roman roads were well engineered. We talked about there being 50,000 miles of roads. We have mosaics. Mosaic, another vocabulary word where it's a piece of artwork made up of small glass tiles or small tiles of different colors to make up a bigger picture. We have aqueducts. These aqueducts were made to build or to bring fresh water from the mountains into the city. Aqueduct is a vocabulary word, and aqueducts just basically do that. They take water from one place to another. And finally, their architecture. Some of the ruins you can still see today in Rome, the actual ruins, and their columns and arches and domes and things like that are still prevalent in our world. So let's look at some examples of some lasting impressions. First of all, architecture. Like I said, this is the Capitol building. The columns, the domes, the arches, all of these are all pieces of Roman architecture. Our form of government. We live in a republic. Rome had a republic. A lot of the philosophy and systems of that government we use in our government in the United States today. Aqueducts. This is the California aqueduct. This still exists today. Southern California, us maybe included, wouldn't really exist the way it does today if the California aqueduct was not created to bring water from the Sierras down to Southern California. Also, language. Spanish, French, Italian, and English, among others, all have common Latin roots. Now, like I said, the western half of Rome fell. The eastern half, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, stayed around for many, many, many years after. That's going to be the next and last section of our Rome unit. So we'll see you next time.